The first generation of gaming consoles is the most interesting time. It would seem that, having remembered the Super Nintendo in the previous episode and thoroughly gone through the Sega Mega Drive, we can move on with a clear conscience. However, while talking about this and that, from time to time there slipped in some mentions of a full-fledged war between these two consoles and their creators, and we've never paid this topic its due attention. That's why today we have an unusual episode, in which I'm going to tell you how the consoles changed coming to America, why Sega does what Nintendo don't, and who went out of their way to take root in the 16-bit era. Welcome to the Drigmatic channel. Stock up on some tea and take a seat. Let's get started. The two giants' rivalry had begun even before the 16-bit consoles were introduced to the world. On one fateful day, the 15th of July 1983, two quite remarkable 8-bit consoles were released in Japan: the Famicom by Nintendo and the SG-1000 by Sega. Both consoles can be considered successful, even though everything is relative. The Famicom was equipped with more powerful hardware and more engaging games. Furthermore, Nintendo was determined to maintain its competitiveness. For example, its developers weren't allowed to release games on their consoles at the same time as on the Famicom. The one thing that can illustrate the success of Famicom is that its American and European versions are known as Nintendo Entertainment System, and the Russian bootleg, for the record, as Dendy Jr. In the meantime, Sega refused to give up. In Japan, it released the 8-bit Sega Mark III, which later arrived in the USA under the name Sega Master System. Everything seemed to be great. The console was more powerful than the NES and had pretty good games. However, by that time, its rival had established itself on the market firmly enough to stop a not-so-skilled marketing team, who had bought the rights to distribute Sega in the USA, as it couldn't confront this 8-bit colossus. Then again, there was always the European market, and in this market, the Master System successfully bested the console by Nintendo. And to consolidate its position in key markets, Japan and the USA to be exact, the somber engineers of Sega almost simultaneously began the development of its future successor. And at that time happened an event that not only changed the fate of the future console, but also marked the real beginning of the 16-bit era: the release of the PC Engine gaming system by NEC. The PC Engine, known in America as TurboGrafx X16, could be considered at least innovative. A 16-bit graphics processor allowed 492 colors to be displayed simultaneously on the screen. For comparison, the NES could only brag about having 25 colors on the screen, which meant that its developers had to employ some little tricks to make the visuals beautiful. Another interesting fact is that the PC Engine initially used its own cartridges, but then appeared an additional device which allowed you to run games on discs, the CD-ROM 2, also known as TurboGrafx CD. Most importantly, the new console provided a fairly impressive library of games: Bonk's Adventure, Splatterhouse, Legendary X, New Adventure Island, and, of course, the game for which it's worth getting to know the console even now, Castlevania Rondo of Blood. It was truly a remarkable game system, deserving to stay in the history among the other representatives of that generation, considering that the boldness of the developers who had decided to confront the two biggest Japanese companies bore fruit. At some point, NEC was dominating almost one-third of the Japanese video game market. Unfortunately, the developers made a number of mistakes in design and marketing. For example, there was an unrestrained craving for innovations, which resulted in NEC constantly releasing new versions of the PC Engine. Eventually, they failed to maintain the success, and the old rivals were left face to face. In the meantime, having taken a look at the release of the PC Engine, Sega made up its mind to finally enter the 16-bit era as well. This decision resulted in an old acquaintance of ours, the Sega Mega Drive. We have already recalled this console as well as its wonderful games, so if you have missed that episode, as always, I recommend you bridge this gap. As for today's topic, you could say that Mega Drive had a pretty curious release. In the fall of 1988, the Japanese started to play the new Sega, and less than a year later, the Mega Drive, which was renamed to Genesis when it was introduced to the Americans. As I mentioned before, the outsourced marketing of the Master System wasn't too successful. So, eventually, Sega, mimicking typical comic villains, decided that if you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself. And to say the least, Genesis' rise in America was truly epic. There was already an established image of Sega as Nintendo's rival. and the company capitalized on that fact. First and foremost, it was obvious in the aggressive advertising. The commercials were straight up saying that Genesis does all that Nintendo doesn't.
Genesis does
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo.
At the time, it was tantamount to the director of Sega coming to the Nintendo CEO and loudly slapping his face with a glove. At every opportunity, Sega boasted about how much cooler its games were, both technically and stylistically. It got to the point where games by Sega received their own seal of quality, a symbol equivalent to the one that had games by Nintendo. However, the seal that Big N had meant that the company was responsible for the quality of every single product they released. This was necessary to fight the infamous video game market collapse, when a vast variety of low-quality titles were appearing, and investors were simply afraid to put their money in. For the same reason, the developers faced a bunch of limitations and inspections before releasing games on the NES. But the only thing the quality seal of Sega was saying is, Genesis does all the same as Nintendo, but without wasting energy on checking the games. Another part of the plan to conquer the American market was to squeeze everything they could out of the arcade past of Sega. A historical fact: the arcade machine Sega System 16 was used as a basis for technical parts during the development of the Mega Drive. It would appear that it was an easy opportunity to take the games that were already popular, but the rights to such arcade games for machines mainly belonged to Nintendo. And to solve this problem, a new, if not really original, games were spiced up with the names of a bunch of celebrities of the time. The brightest example of the celebrities' participation was the game Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. The fact that I didn't mention it with the kind word in the relevant episode is a subtle hint at a rather low quality of the game. Even if it's a beat-em-up in which we're controlling the King of Pop himself, this extraordinary idea still has to be supported by interesting gameplay. In sum, all this aggressive marketing was effective, but wasn't as stunning as everyone expected. In any case, the Genesis managed to shake the NES. Besides, the 8-bit old fellow, by the 7th year of its existence, had already showed all it was capable of. And it was the decreasing popularity of the NES that made Nintendo finally think about breaking into the 16-bit trend. That's right, now a brand new gaming system, the Super Nintendo, or rather the Super Famicom, the Japanese version, has come into play. The reputation that the company and the previous console had was enough for the new product to start retaking the Japanese market, and 9 months later it set off to the American market. The console was obviously redesigned, and it was renamed to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, SNES. However, Sega wasn't going to give in that easily. By that time, it had been doing great both in Japanese and American markets. So it used that to put pressure. Immediately came commercials, saying that Sega already had 150 games, and the SNES hardly had any. Well, except maybe Super Mario World, which came with it.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
But kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog, more action, more speed. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
I get that I sound like a huge Mario fan, but you shouldn't think that I disrespect Sega. I also have warm feelings for the Mega Drive. But this marketing campaign, for example, Sega rigorously promoted the feature of the Genesis called blast processing. The answer to the question what makes the Genesis the best console was simply blast processing. That it was a fake term used as a marketing trick. That it meant that the Genesis could quickly move graphics on the screen. And that is true. And finally, that it was a truly working feature that had never been used in games, however. Each of these options conveys the same message. Sega took advantage of any advertising opportunity, no matter how dubious. But what was definitely the right decision was the creation of a mascot, which became no less iconic than the world-famous Mario. The conceptualization process of creating the supersonic hedgehog's image was similar to scientific research. How convenient that we made a separate video about that, and I recommend you watch it to learn the details. Here I'll say that the idea worked out brilliantly, allowing Sega to take 65% of the American market. Sonic featured in many commercials, down to the Russian TV program Sonic Super Yojik. And now, along with the console, came not the average altered beast, but the awesome first Sonic. Meanwhile, SNES just sold well. I mean, Nintendo wasn't idling about, and, for example, the legendary Street Fighter II worked on their console much faster than on the console by Sega. but there weren't any similar aggressive actions from the Super Famicom. But there were games that amazed us one after another. They were even among the first ones to use 3D graphics. We also have a separate video about that, and without watching it, your knowledge of the world of 16-bit entertainment will also be incomplete. So make sure to watch it as well. As for our console wars, SNES quickly caught up with and then crushed the competitor, and for the most part due to its quality and company reputation. And to be fair, I should say that on the American market, the Genesis was still more successful than the console by Nintendo. The video game colossuses could have continued their console wars all they wanted, but a new opponent who threatened to change everything showed up on the scene. So this is how it all went down. Trying to maintain its competitiveness, Sega started to develop add-ons for the Genesis, the Sega 32X and Sega CD. They expanded the console's abilities, allowing it to launch more demanding games. The second add-on could also work with discs. It wasn't a huge success, but Nintendo also started creating a CD drive for the SNES. To work on it, they signed a contract with a certain Sony company. And that's right, you can already see how that ended. But initially, Sony worked on this project and they were even going to introduce a console, SNES CD. For the record, there even exists a prototype of that thing, and it looks peculiar to say the least. However, Nintendo reviewed the contract and understood that it was given too many rights to Sony, so it signed an agreement with the company Philips at the last minute. The representatives of Sony couldn't deal with such a backstabbing act, and that pushed them to make their own console. The stained Japanese honor was to be cleansed by a gaming system known to anyone with at least a passing interest in modern culture – the Sony PlayStation. Anyway, it was this spectacular mistake made by Nintendo, which led to the end of the 16-bit era. And then, a completely different 32-bit story awaited us. But this is a talk for another time. Today's story turned out to be pretty long, so it's time to finish it. I'd like to invite you to the comment section. Tell us which of the mentioned consoles you owned, and what you remember the 16-bit era to be like. Besides, don't forget to like the video and click on the bell. The 16-bit era has come to an end, but not the history of video games, and we definitely have more to talk about. So stay tuned. Until we meet again.